When a 3-month-old lion cub refused to abandon his mother's lifeless body on the scorching plains of the Kalahari, what happened over the next 7 days would challenge everything we think we know about love, loyalty, and the will to survive. This is the story of Kesi, a name that means born during troubled times in the ancient language of the desert winds, and how one small act of devotion would transform not just his own destiny, but the entire balance of life in one of Africa's most unforgiving landscapes. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Kalahari Desert stretched endlessly under a copper sky, its red sand dunes shifting like ocean waves frozen in time. Unlike the lush savannas of East Africa, this was a land where survival meant understanding the language of drought, where every drop of moisture was precious, and where the seasons were measured not by rain and dry spells, but by the subtle changes in wind direction and the migration patterns of the hardy antelope that called this harsh paradise home. Here, among the scattered camelthorn trees and vast expanses of desert grass, the great predators had learned to be patient. The spotted hyenas that roamed these lands were leaner and more cunning than their cousins in wetter regions. The leopards had become masters of stealth, their rosette patterns perfectly suited to the dappled shadows cast by sparse vegetation. And the lions, the desert lions of the Kalahari, were a breed apart, their manes lighter, their bodies more compact, their hunting strategies adapted to a world where prey was scarce, and distances between water sources could span dozens of kilometers. The acacia woodland where Kesi's pride had made their territory was a relatively green oasis in this ocean of sand and stone. Ancient leadwood trees, their bark scarred by elephant tusks, and their branches home to weaver birds and hornbills, created a canopy that offered precious shade during the brutal midday hours. Underground springs fed a network of seasonal pans that would fill with life-giving water during the brief rainy months, attracting vast herds of springbok, gemsbok, and kudu. This was the domain of the Mokala pride, named after the distinctive orange-flowered trees that bloomed along the dry riverbeds. For generations, this pride had ruled over nearly 200 square kilometers of territory, their roars echoing across the desert at dawn and dusk, warning rival prides and nomadic males that these hunting grounds were claimed. The pride consisted of 5 adult lionesses, each a master hunter in her own right. There was Amale, the lead huntress, whose amber eyes could spot the slightest movement of prey from impossible distances. Naledi, whose name meant star, was known for her ability to navigate by the southern constellations during night hunts that could last until dawn. Thabo brought wisdom earned through 12 seasons of survival in this harsh land, her scars telling stories of battles fought and won. Django possessed a patience that allowed her to wait motionless for hours beside game trails, striking with lightning precision when the moment was perfect. And finally, there was Sekai, Kesi's mother, whose gentle nature masked the fierce protection she showed toward the pride's young. The cubs of the Mokala pride were the future of this ancient lineage. Kesi shared his world with 6 other young lions, each born during the season when the desert briefly transformed into a garden of wildflowers. There was bold Jabari, who had already begun to show the dark mane growth that would one day mark him as a dominant male. Swift-footed Amara spent her days practicing the stalking techniques she observed from the adult hunters. Little Kibo, barely larger than Kesi, possessed a roar that seemed far too big for his small frame. The twins, Desta and Duma, were inseparable, often found curled together under the shade of their favorite camelthorn tree. And finally, there was Zara, the only other female cub, whose green eyes held an intelligence that suggested she might one day lead a pride of her own. Life in the Kalahari followed ancient rhythms. The pride would rest during the scorching heat of midday, sprawled in whatever shade they could find, their breathing slow and measured to conserve energy. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the lionesses would begin to stir. This was the time of the hunt, when the cooler air allowed for the explosive bursts of speed and endurance required to bring down prey in this challenging environment. The cubs, still too young to participate in the dangerous work of hunting, would remain behind in the safety of the pride's core territory. They would play among the red rocks and thorny bushes, their games teaching them the skills they would need as adults, the art of the ambush, the importance of teamwork, the delicate balance between patience and explosive action that defined the life of a desert predator. But beneath the surface of this seemingly eternal existence, changes were stirring across the vast landscape of the Kalahari, changes that would soon shatter the peaceful world of the Mokala pride and test the bonds that held their family together. For Kesi, each dawn brought the same comforting ritual that had defined his short life in the Kalahari. As the first pale light crept across the horizon, he would feel the gentle warmth of his mother Sekai's breath against his fur, her massive paw often draped protectively across his small body. The sound of her steady heartbeat had become his most trusted companion, a rhythmic drumming that promised safety in a world where danger lurked beyond every shadow. Sekai possessed a unique gentleness among the Mokala lionesses, though her hunting prowess remained unquestionable. Where Amali ruled through fierce dominance and Naledi commanded respect through her strategic brilliance, Sekai led through patience and understanding. She had given birth to 3 previous litters, losing cubs to the harsh realities of desert life, and this experience had taught her to treasure each moment with her surviving offspring. Her golden coat bore the faded scars of territorial battles and hunting accidents, but her dark eyes held a warmth that drew not only her own cubs but the other young lions of the pride. Kesi had been the smallest of Sekai's current litter, born nearly an hour after his siblings during a night when the desert winds carried the scent of distant rain. While Jabari had emerged, roaring his defiance at the world, and the twins had immediately begun competing for their mother's attention, Kesi had arrived quietly, his tiny mews barely audible above the whispered conversations of the attending lionesses. Sekai had cleaned him with extra care, her rough tongue working patiently to stimulate his breathing, her instincts telling her that this smallest cub would need additional protection to survive in their unforgiving homeland. The bond between mother and son had deepened through countless shared experiences. During the scorching afternoons when the other cubs sought the coolest spots beneath the leadwood trees, Kesi preferred to remain close to Sekai's side, often curled against her belly while she groomed his rapidly growing coat. She would tell him stories through low rumbles and gentle chuffs, a primitive language that conveyed the history of their territory, the personalities of each pride member, and the ancient wisdom that had allowed their lineage to thrive in the Kalahari for countless generations. Sekai's hunting territory encompassed the northeastern section of the pride's domain, where a seasonal river had carved deep channels through the red earth. During the dry months, these channels became highways for migrating antelope, creating natural ambush points that Sekai had learned to exploit with deadly efficiency. She often brought Kesi to observe from safe distances, teaching him to read the subtle signs that preceded a successful hunt, the way springbok ears twitched when they sensed danger, the wind patterns that could carry a predator's scent, the crucial moment when patience transformed into explosive action. The pride's social structure provided Kesi with an extended family that enriched every aspect of his development. Aunt Thabo, despite her reputation as the pride's most formidable fighter, would spend patient hours teaching the cubs how to sharpen their claws on the bark of camelthorn trees, showing them the precise angle needed to maintain their most important weapons. She had lost her own cubs to a coalition of rival males 2 seasons earlier, and she channeled her maternal instincts into caring for her sister's offspring with fierce dedication. Naledi contributed a different kind of wisdom, often leading the cubs on extended explorations of their territory during the cooler hours of evening. Under her guidance, Kesi learned to recognize the distinctive calls of different bird species, understanding that the alarm cries of ground hornbills could signal approaching danger, while the songs of crimson-breasted shrikes often indicated the presence of small prey animals. She taught them to read the stories written in the sand, the tracks that revealed which animals had visited the watering holes, the direction they had traveled, and how long ago they had passed. Django's contributions were more subtle, but equally valuable. Her extraordinary patience had made her the pride's most successful night hunter, and she shared this temperament with the cubs through quiet example. When Jabari or the twins became restless during long afternoons, Django would demonstrate the meditation-like stillness that allowed a predator to conserve energy while remaining alert to opportunities. Kesi proved particularly receptive to these lessons, his naturally quiet demeanor making him an ideal student for Django's teachings about the power of observation and timing. Amali, as the pride's alpha female, maintained a more formal relationship with the cubs, but her protection was absolute. She had established clear boundaries around their core territory, marking strategic points with scent that warned potential threats to stay away. Her presence provided the foundation of security that allowed the other lionesses to focus on nurturing and education rather than constant vigilance. When she returned from successful hunts, her call would echo across the desert, and Kesi would feel his small chest swell with pride at belonging to such a powerful family. The cub's daily routines revolved around play that gradually developed into training. Wrestling matches with his siblings taught Kesi about leverage and balance, while games of hide-and-seek among the thorn bushes honed his natural camouflage instincts. Racing competitions across the red sand developed his speed and endurance, though Kesi's smaller size meant he relied more on agility and cunning than brute force to keep pace with his larger siblings. Evening grooming sessions brought the entire pride together in peaceful communion, each lioness methodically cleaning her cubs while maintaining the social bonds that held their family together through the challenges of desert survival. The morning that would shatter Kesi's world began like countless others, with the pride stirring as the first golden rays pierced the pre-dawn darkness. The adult lionesses stretched their powerful limbs, preparing for what they hoped would be a successful hunt before the day's heat became unbearable. A herd of gemsbok had been spotted near the seasonal waterhole 2 kilometers to the west, their distinctive black and white markings visible even in the dim light as they cautiously approached the life-giving water. Sekai nuzzled Kesi awake with unusual urgency, her deep purr carrying an undertone of excitement that immediately captured his attention. The hunt would be challenging. Gemsbok were among the most alert and aggressive antelope species in the Kalahari, their sharp horns capable of inflicting fatal wounds on careless predators. But the pride had not made a successful kill in 4 days, and the growing hunger in their bellies demanded action despite the risks involved. As the lionesses gathered for their pre-hunt coordination, Sekai's attention was divided between the strategic discussions and her instinctive need to ensure her cubs' safety. She led Kesi and his siblings to a natural fortress of red sandstone boulders that had served as a nursery for generations of Mokala cubs. The rocky outcropping provided multiple escape routes and elevated vantage points, while the maze-like passages between the stones offered perfect hiding spots for young lions not yet ready to defend themselves. Amali's tactical mind had identified the optimal approach to the gemsbok herd, utilizing the natural contours of the landscape to mask their advance. The plan required precise timing. Naledi and Thabo would circle wide to the north, using a dry riverbed as cover to position themselves behind the herd's likely escape route. Meanwhile, Sekai, Django, and Amale would approach from the east, remaining downwind to avoid detection by the antelope's sensitive noses. The attack would unfold in 3 phases. First, the eastern group would reveal themselves at a calculated distance, causing the gemsbok to flee toward what appeared to be safety. The second phase would trigger when the panicked herd encountered Naledi and Thabo's blocking position, forcing them to change direction again. Finally, in the chaos of confusion, all 5 lionesses would converge on their selected target, a young male gemsbok whose slightly limping gait suggested a recent injury that might slow his escape. Kesi watched his mother's final preparations with the intense fascination that had characterized all their shared moments. Sekai methodically stretched each muscle group, her movements flowing with the grace of a predator in perfect physical condition. She tested the wind direction by tasting the air with her sensitive nose, confirming that their scent would not betray their approach. Her claws extended and retracted as she flexed her paws, ensuring that these crucial weapons were ready for the explosive moment of contact. Before departing, Sekai returned to her cubs for what would become their last shared moment of peace. She groomed each young lion with careful attention, her rough tongue working to flatten any fur that might catch on thorns during their wait. When she reached Kesi, her movements slowed, and she spent extra time cleaning behind his ears in the gentle manner that had always been their special ritual. Her deep amber eyes held his gaze for several heartbeats, and she released a soft chuff that seemed to carry more meaning than usual. The hunt began with the patient stalk that characterized all successful predation in the desert. The lionesses moved like shadows across the landscape, their tawny coats blending perfectly with the golden grass and red earth. From his elevated position among the rocks, Kesi could track their progress by the occasional flash of movement as they navigated around obstacles or paused to reassess their target's position. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Gemsbok herd maintained their nervous vigilance, heads lifting frequently from the water to scan for danger. Their leader, a magnificent female with horns that gleamed like polished obsidian, positioned herself where she could monitor all approaches while her companions drank. The injured male that had drawn the lioness's attention remained at the herd's periphery, his disadvantage making him naturally cautious, but also isolating him from the group's protective formation. Everything proceeded according to Amali's carefully crafted plan until the moment when nature's unpredictability intervened with devastating consequences. As Sekai moved through a patch of dense grass, approaching her assigned position for the coordinated attack, the ground beneath her paws suddenly gave way. What had appeared to be solid earth was actually the thin roof of an abandoned aardvark burrow, weakened by recent underground water flow and unable to support her weight. Sekai plunged through the collapsing surface, her powerful body twisting desperately as she tried to control her fall. The burrow was deeper than expected, its walls carved from the hard-packed clay that lay beneath the sandy topsoil. Her spine struck the far wall with a sickening impact that echoed through the underground chamber, the sound muffled but unmistakable to the other lionesses who had been depending on her coordination for the hunt's success. The Gemsbok herd, startled by the sudden commotion, abandoned their drinking and fled across the desert in a cloud of red dust, their hoofbeats drumming a rhythm of escape that would haunt Kesi's memories. But for him, watching from his rocky sanctuary, the world had already transformed into something unrecognizable, something terrifying and forever changed. The silence that followed Sekai's disappearance stretched across the Kalahari like a held breath, broken only by the distant drumming of fleeing Gemsbok hooves and the whisper of wind through desert grass. From their rocky fortress, Kesi and his siblings strained to understand what had happened to their mother, their young minds struggling to process the sudden absence where her familiar golden form should have been visible among the hunting party. Amali's commanding roar shattered the eerie quiet, calling off the hunt and summoning the scattered lionesses to converge on Sekai's last known position. The Pride leader's voice carried notes of urgency that even the cubs could recognize, though they had never heard such distress in her typically controlled communications. Naledi and Thabo abandoned their blocking positions, racing across the red sand with desperate speed while Jengo emerged from her concealed location, her usually patient demeanor replaced by frantic concern. What the lionesses discovered when they reached the collapsed burrow would haunt the Mokala pride for generations to come. The aardvark excavation was part of an extensive underground network that had been expanding beneath their territory for months, its tunnels weakened by the unusual rainfall patterns that had characterized the previous season. The extra moisture had softened the clay foundations that normally provided structural integrity to these subterranean chambers, creating hidden death traps throughout an area the pride had considered completely familiar. Sekai lay motionless at the bottom of the 6-foot pit, her powerful body twisted at an unnatural angle that immediately revealed the devastating nature of her injuries. Her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, each exhalation accompanied by a sound that spoke of internal damage beyond the healing power of time or rest. The vertebrae along her spine had compressed upon impact, severing the neural pathways that controlled movement in her hindquarters, and creating a cascade of physiological failures that would prove irreversible. The other lionesses worked frantically to reach their injured pride sister, their claws scraping against the hard-packed clay walls as they attempted to widen the burrow opening. But even as they labored, their experienced eyes recognized the hopelessness of Sekai's condition. In the harsh arithmetic of survival that governed life in the Kalahari, injuries of this magnitude meant only one outcome, regardless of the emotional bonds that connected the pride members to their fallen sister. This was not the first time that hidden burrows had claimed a member of the Mokala pride. 3 seasons earlier, Amali's own mother had disappeared during a night hunt, her body discovered days later in a similar excavation several kilometers away. The desert was riddled with these underground mazes, created by aardvarks, ground squirrels, and other burrowing creatures whose industrious digging served their survival needs but created hazardous obstacles for larger predators navigating the landscape in pursuit of prey. The geological composition of their territory made these collapses particularly treacherous. Beneath the surface layer of wind-blown sand lay deposits of clay and calcrete that had formed over millennia of alternating wet and dry periods. When moisture levels increased, either from unusual rainfall or underground seepage, These normally solid foundations became unstable, creating voids that could support the weight of smaller animals but would give way catastrophically under the mass of an adult lion. Traditional knowledge passed down through generations of pride leaders had identified many of these dangerous areas, marking them through scent trails and avoiding them during hunts. But the expanding network of tunnels constantly created new hazards, and the recent climatic variations had accelerated the process of underground erosion in previously safe zones. The very success of the Mokala pride in maintaining their territory had led them to develop a sense of familiarity that had, in this crucial moment, overcome their natural caution. As the day progressed and Sekai's condition continued to deteriorate, the other lionesses made the difficult decision to relocate the cubs to a position where they could witness their mother's final hours. This was not cruelty, but education. In the harsh academy of desert survival, young lions needed to understand the reality of death and the importance of accepting nature's sometimes brutal lessons. The pride gathered in a solemn circle around the collapsed burrow, their presence providing what comfort was possible for their dying sister. Kesi's first encounter with mortality came through a confusion of sensations that his developing mind struggled to interpret. He could smell the change in his mother's scent, detecting the chemical signatures that accompanied serious injury and approaching death. Her breathing had become irregular, punctuated by long pauses that stretched his anxiety to breaking points before resuming with desperate gasps. Most disturbing of all, when she tried to lift her head to see her cubs. The movement that had always been fluid and graceful now required tremendous effort and caused visible pain. Huntrang, the other lionesses, took turns descending partway into the burrow to provide physical contact and emotional support, their gentle chuffs and careful grooming offering what solace was possible in this impossible situation. But as the hours passed and Sekai's responses became increasingly weak, even the cubs began to understand that their mother would not be emerging from this earthen grave to resume her place in their daily lives. As the desert sun reached its merciless peak, Sekai's labored breathing grew fainter, each exhale carrying her further from the world of the living. The other lionesses had gradually stepped back, understanding that these final moments belonged to her cubs alone. Kesi pressed himself against the edge of the burrow, his small paws reaching down toward his mother's still form, refusing to abandon her even as life slowly ebbed from her broken body. When Sekai's breathing finally ceased, the silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped, the birds fell quiet, and even the insects seemed to pause in recognition of this profound loss. But Kesi remained at his post, his golden eyes fixed on his mother's peaceful face, his young heart unable to accept what his mind was beginning to understand. For 3 days and nights, Kesi maintained his vigil. The other lionesses brought him water and small portions of meat, but he barely acknowledged their presence. His siblings eventually retreated to shadier resting spots, their own grief processed through the natural resilience of youth. But Kesi stayed, his small body curled at the burrow's edge, his nose occasionally touching his mother's cooling fur. On the 4th dawn, something extraordinary happened. As the first light painted the desert gold, Sekai's scent began to fade, replaced by something else, the faint but unmistakable smell of new life. Deep within the abandoned aardvark tunnels, moisture had collected, creating perfect conditions for desert seeds that had lain dormant for years. Tiny green shoots began emerging from the earth around Sekai's body, transforming her resting place into an unexpected garden. Kesi finally understood. His mother had not simply died. She had become part of the eternal cycle that sustained all life in the Kalahari. The minerals from her body would nourish these plants, which would feed the antelope, which would sustain future generations of lions. His vigil had not been about refusing to let go, but about witnessing the miracle of transformation that death makes possible. As Amale gently guided him away from the burrow, Kesi carried with him a wisdom that would define his character for life. He had learned that love sometimes means staying present through the unbearable, that loyalty transcends the boundary between life and death, and that even in loss there can be profound beauty. If Kesi's story of unbreakable devotion moved you as much as it moved us, please subscribe to our channel and share this incredible tale of love that defies nature itself. These stories of courage and connection remind us what truly matters in life.